Long before our modern conceptions of fantasy and magic, the cosmos was thought to be a totally distinct plane of existence from our life here on Earth. Ancient astrologers believed that the planets not only moved according to rules of logic, but also influenced our daily lives in substantial ways. In this video, we'll examine how these ideas manifested in ancient astrology, we'll reconstruct a model of a geocentric universe, and we'll discover how the power of planets can be transformed into a game's magic system. The focus of our inquiry is on an ancient astronomer named Ptolemy, whom I already covered in an earlier video, but this time we'll be looking at his book Tetrabiblos. His prior work, the Almagest, is a book on astronomy, whereas the Tetrabiblos focuses on astrology. Just from the etymology of these words, we can get a concept of their difference. The word astron means star, and nomos can mean rule or law, so astronomy pertains to the rules of planetary motion. Astrology, on the other hand, is split into astron and logia. In the modern sense of logia or logi, it typically means the study of, but here it may have a dual meaning. Logia has some connection to the prophecies of oracles, so we might think of astrology as not only the study of the stars, but also the prophecies of the stars themselves. In any case, Ptolemy declares that the goal of his book is to discover how practical it is to gain prophetic power through observations of the heavens, and we'll be using the attributes he ascribes to planets to create our magic system. To get started, let's lay out some basic assumptions. We are working with a geocentric model of the universe, and there are only 7 planets that the ancient astronomers observed. The Earth doesn't count as a planet, because the heavens are different in nature from our existence here on Earth. Ptolemy's basic reasoning about the power of the planets is this. The Sun and Moon have very obvious effects on the sublunary sphere, such as seasonal changes and affecting the tides. So these other bodies that are of the same kind must also exert some influence. In this project, we'll be precisely focusing on the power of the planets and how they connect to classical elements. For this, we'll need some planets, which means we have to start by creating the universe. Let's begin by placing the planets and determining their motion. If you know something about astronomy, you may be aware that some planets undergo a process called retrograde motion. This is when a planet appears to reverse its direction relative to its normal cycle. I won't get into too much detail on Ptolemy's geometry that accounts for this motion because my previous project already explains how he calculated the sun's movement, but the overarching idea is that the planets have 2 circular orbits, which are the main orbit itself and then an epicycle, which is a smaller orbit along the main orbit. When a planet like Mercury reaches a certain point on this epicycle, it appears to move backwards. This model ends up creating a cool spirograph effect when you trace out the movement of the planets. I decided to keep the planets along this singular plane because of this effect. There are a couple things I'm ignoring in the construction of the universe here. First of all, Ptolemy did not believe in the rotation of the Earth, because if the Earth rotated, then of course all the clouds would appear to move in the same direction, which we don't see. This means that the daily orbit of the Sun is caused by the rotation of the heavenly sphere. I've simplified the simulation to only include the movement of the planets separate from the rotating heavens, so here, the day and night are both half a year long, making the day-night cycle a full year. This is important for gameplay reasons because we want to have planetary bodies change their relative positions in a timely manner without creating a constant strobing day-night cycle. One other small thing is that I'm not including the axial tilt of the Earth, which would normally account for the seasons, but we don't really need that here. Now that we have the heavenly bodies in place, how can we connect astrology? In the Tetrabiblos, Ptolemy talks about different properties connected to the planets. The 2 gradients that we'll focus on are hot and cold and dry and moist. Every planet shares in at least one of these properties. I created a couple meters to track these values, so when a planet approaches its zenith, its influence is the strongest. We can make use of these values by tying them to the 4 classical elements: fire, air, water, and earth. If we look back a few hundred years further, in Aristotle's On Generation and Corruption, he lays out the connection between these properties of hot, cold, dry, moist, and the four elements. From a gameplay perspective, the player will have access to an element as long as both of its opposites are not dominant. For example, here is a fire spell that can be cast when it's not dominantly cold and moist. The fireball also scales with its compatible aspects, so its damage and size increase as it gets hotter and drier. In terms of the planets, if both the Sun and Mars are near their zenith, then the fire spell is at its most powerful. I added a spell for each element, so wind creates a cone that knocks back objects, and the strength of it scales with heat and moisture. The player's sprint speed also scales with wind attributes. Water creates a spray that can grow crops, and the growth is increased with coldness and moisture. And lastly, Earth creates a wall that scales with coldness and dryness. I wasn't totally sure where I wanted to go with a gameplay loop, but I decided on a sort of farm defense game where you have a collection of crops, and these weird little floaty monsters want to eat all your cabbages.
No, my cabbages!
I also added a hunger meter for the player, so you have to constantly eat cabbages to keep going, but when you eat one, it can be regrown with your water spell, whereas the enemies completely destroy it. Because Ptolemy mentioned that Jupiter has a special property of fertilizing winds, when Jupiter is near its zenith, destroyed crops can regrow. I ended up adding an ice spell as another long-ranged option for when the fire spell is unavailable, and it's castable as long as cold is the dominant attribute. It has a slower fire rate and deals less damage than Fireball, but it freezes enemies in place for a little while. For one final spell, I made a wind boost where you can look at the ground and push off of it, but it costs a little bit of hunger to use. When most people think of astrology, they probably think of the zodiac, and Ptolemy discusses that at length as well. There are all kinds of other important planetary positions based on one's birth sign, like ruling planets in a system called houses. I decided not to get into zodiac-related attributes in this project just for the sake of keeping the scope reasonable, but there are really so many possibilities for how an astrological magic system could be further developed. One of the most magical attributes that Ptolemy assigns to the planets is the ability to predict events such as famine, prosperity, war, peace, natural disasters, and so on. There's also a section dedicated to how the planets relate to disease. A system that has events based on a player's birth zodiac sign could really have a lot of depth, but I think this project ended up in a cool spot by just focusing on planetary power. I've never really been into astrology before, so I don't know much about modern interpretations, and while I don't expect to be checking my daily horoscope on the regular, I did gain an appreciation for the wonderment that the ancients had towards the heavenly sphere by working on this project, and I hope I managed to share some of that here. Thank you all for watching, and thank you to my supporters on Patreon. Until next time.